I guess we have not yet started. And so once Mr. Shrivastava joins, I guess we will start.
Okay, I see Indrani here. Is that Mr. Shrivastava is here?
Yeah.
Indrani is from IIC, I think.
I thought it was Rudrani.
No, Rudrani is on her. I see. There she is. Hi, Indrani.
Okay,
how are you?
Yeah, good evening, everybody. I'm K.N. Srivastava here. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. I think Indrani is muted.
Indrani, yes, Indrani.
She's muted.
Yeah, Indrani. Yes, Indrani.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
But we can't see you.
Can you see
now
me?
I can see you, sir. Now I can see you, sir.
Okay.
Yes. I'm glad you're back.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
So, shall we start or we have to wait for some more time?
I think we can start. It's 5 minutes over. Yeah.
Mr. Shekhar Shah will be joining us.
Yeah, Mr. Srivastava.
I'm here.
Yeah, he's already here. Mr. Shah is already here.
Okay.
But I'm in a public place, so I have to wear a mask.
Okay. Friends, I extend a very warm welcome to each one of you and to all the participants who have joined us. As you are all aware that around this time we have this mid-year review of Indian economy seminar. Now this year the physical mode was not possible, so therefore the seminar has become a webinar. On this day we also remember Dr. Malcolm Adsheshaya. As we all know, he was a great development economist, and he had interest in many other fields as well. He was particularly committed to the eradication of poverty and illiteracy from India. He was an institution builder. The Madras Institute of Development Study was very close to his heart. He is also remembered for setting up the famous Dr. Malcolm and Elizabeth Adsheshaya Trust in 1999, to which he committed all his finances. His association with IIC indeed is eternal. In 1960, he got UNESCO affiliation for IIC. Later on, he was also made the life trustee of IIC. The mid-year review of Indian economy initiated by him in the year 1975-76, and even till today, it is one of the most definitive surveys of Indian growth projection. It examines the course of microeconomic trends in the first half of the year and provides assessment of the prospects for the full year. The Malcolm and Elizabeth Adsheshaya Trust has been supporting this seminar since 2001. Its proceedings are published as a book. This year, Professor Sudipto Mundle and other panelists, which includes Rudrani Bhattacharya and Bonali Bhandari, as well as the two discussants, Mr. Aditi Nair and Tirthankar Patnaik. So they will be, taking us through this the subject. I extend a very personal welcome on behalf of IIC to each one of them. This year's midterm economic review is rather difficult because the pandemic has really upset everything else. And for the economist, it's going to be a real challenge to make any kind of projection because one does not know as to when the impact of COVID-19 is going to dissipate. Although a group of our scientists, through their mathematical modeling, have predicted that by January, the pandemic situation will come substantially under control in so far India is concerned, meaning thereby that thereafter we can really look for good days, both on the economic front and on other fronts as well. I would not like to say more on this occasion because we're all here to listen to Dr. Sudipto Mundle and others. So with these initial remarks, I once again extend a very hearty welcome to each one of you. And now I invite, is Mr. Shekhar Shah connected with us? May I now request Mr. Shekhar Shah is connected to make his initial remarks before inviting the panelists to take over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Shrivastava. It's indeed a pleasure and a privilege to be collaborating with the India International Center, with whom we share a very strong legacy in the sense that the founder of IIC, C.D. Deshmukh, was also a founder member of the governing body of NCAER, and two institutions that Dr. Deshmukh created apart from his long tenure at the RBI were the IIC and NCAER. So we see Dr. Deshmukh is also a founding father of the National Council of Applied Economic Research. My name is Shekhar Shah. I'm the Director General of NCER, and we have truly found great privilege and pleasure in collaborating with IIC on the video review of the economy. We have a stellar panel this evening with two very prominent market-based economists, amongst the best in India, Ms. Aditi Nair, who is Vice President and Principal Economist at ICRA, and Tirthankar Patnaik, who is the Chief Economist at the National Stock Exchange. Both are well known for their direct, honest, and rigorous analysis of what's happening to the Indian economy. As Mr. Shrivastava said, this is a difficult moment in almost every country's economy and its society. Certainly is the case in India, with the vast disparities between the extremely wealthy and the extremely poor, between different sectors of the economy, between agriculture, industry, and services. And all of this that we have seen in the last 9-10 months portends different things for our future going into 21-22 and ending 2021. So there's a lot that needs to be thought through, and we are incredibly blessed to have Dr. Sudipto Mundle, Dr. Bonali Bhandari at NCAER, Dr. Rudrani Bhattacharya at NIPFP, who is collaborating with us, and their entire team to tell us more about this. This is perhaps the most important video review that I believe we have done in the last few years. And I think it will hold the key to many, many, many issues that will confront us and the challenges the economy will face in the years to come. So with that, let me invite Dr. Sudipto Mundle to lead off the discussion. Sudipto.
Thank you, Shekhar. Thank you, Shekhar. Participants, let me join the two co-hosts in welcoming all of you and say a good day to you, because some of you are to the east of us. We are located in Delhi. Some of you are to the west of us, all the way to the United States. And Shekhar himself is chairing this from the Heathrow Airport in London. So this is the reality of globalized virtual reality that we're living in today. And I think we will continue with this even after the pandemic is over. But meanwhile, we are in this situation, and we are, as was mentioned, doing our best to cope with it. I should mention at the outset that though only a few of us will be making presentations, we actually have a very large team that has worked on preparing this media review. And you see that on the screen in front of you, even as I speak, the study team as well as the organizational support team. And as Shekhar mentioned, we also particularly would like to welcome Aditi Nair and Dr. Tirthankar Patnaik, who are our guest panelists.
Sudipto, before you proceed, may I just make the announcement that we are also live on YouTube on the channel that has been advertised, so that that is also something that both panelists and, of course, all the participants should be aware of. Thank you, Shri.
Thank you. So here's the outline of the presentation. After this short introduction from me, my colleague Bornali will take over and will walk you through all the real sectors, agriculture, industry, services, and also the external sector. After that, Dr. Rudrani from NIPFP will discuss the price situation and inflation. I will then come back to discuss our GDP forecasts and the long-term implications of it, of the big shock, negative shock that we're receiving, or what we call hysteresis, and the question of reform and so on that will be required as a positive shock to offset the negative shock that we have received this year. I'll then go on to talking about policy issues, macro policy, first fiscal policy, the fiscal policy outlook, and then the monetary policy and financial sector reforms. The background to all of this is, of course, the pandemic that we have been living with throughout this year. And that is certainly continuing to constrain economic activity. However, there are some positive developments. The pandemic actually peaked around the middle of September, and it has been coming down since then fairly steadily. We are now from over 1,000 deaths at its peak. We now have a situation where about 300, 400, up to 400 people, we are still losing every day. And it's a very bad situation, but better than where we were 2-3 months ago. The other aspect of the pandemic that we need to keep in view is that actually 75% of all the deaths have actually occurred just in Maharashtra, which alone accounts for something like 35% of the total number of deaths, and just 6 other states, namely Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Delhi, West Bengal, Uttar Pradesh, and Andhra Pradesh. If you think about it, these are all states which have in them the biggest metropolises in this country. In other words, it is very much a kind of, the pandemic is very much an urban-centered crisis, especially in the largest cities, and if we can learn to manage the spread and the contagion in the cities, we probably would have learned to live with the pandemic, rather with the virus, even if it will not be completely eliminated. We in Delhi did experience a third wave till the middle of November. Now that has been fortunately subsiding. And with that, all these 6 states, the concentrated zones of this crisis, have actually, we are now seeing a declining trend. The other positive aspect is that, as you know, vaccines actually have been rolled out in some countries already, and we are expecting it to be rolled out here, some vaccines in India, by the first quarter of 2021, next 3 or 4 months. So that's some positive news in the background. But meanwhile, the economy has been suffering, and we expect that it will leave its long-term mark for many, many years. With the gradual unlocking that happened from the end of March, the economy started recovering quite sharply. In fact, it recovered much more sharply than most of us had expected through May and June. And it has continued to recover after that, but at a more moderated pace since the end of June. Apart from the supply side unlocking, fiscal and monetary policy stimulus have also supported this recovery. We shall come back to discussing this later. A third key takeaway from our presentation today is that the recovery has actually been very broad-based across all sectors. Agriculture was never adversely affected, but it's spread across all of industry and services. But you do have large variations across sectors as well as within sectors. Now, this pattern is very similar across all sectors, namely that you got a very sharp decline in April following the lockdown, a very sharp recovery through May and June, and then that became shallower, that V-shaped recovery after June. This is such a stable pattern that we expect that the same pattern is going to be followed by the overall GDP. We are actually forecasting that for this year as a whole, the Indian economy will shrink by 7.3%. And we will come back to the forecast discussions later. Our projections also indicate, as I said, that there will be very long-term effects of this negative shock, which are likely to last for years. If we want to minimize that, in a sense, get a positive shock to offset the negative shock we have just received, conventional macroeconomic policy stimulation measures will not be enough. We will need very broad-based structural reforms to get India back to a high growth path. With that, I will now hand over the presentation to Varnali, who is going to walk us through the real sector. Varnali.
Thank you, Dr. Mundle. Welcome to all of you. So I'm going to speak about on the supply side, essentially the supply side sectors, agriculture, industry, services first. As you know, the agriculture has been the positive story throughout. We actually saw that in the first half of the current financial year, we saw that agriculture was going to have this estimated growth was 3.4%. This was mainly due to good monsoon, as you can see on the graph on the right hand side, the blue color, which actually shows that we had normal rainfall for the country as a whole, barring the northern region, which had some deficit deviation from normal rainfall. Overall, we had the rainfall was good. So, given this, even on the left hand side, we have the estimated Kharif crop, which shows that from the first advanced estimates, which shows again normal production, slightly higher, especially paddy, but more or less compared to last year, we are going to be normal. So the first advanced estimates indicate robust agricultural output, and then if we look at Rabi output, that is the winter crop, what we find is that because we had normal rainfall, our reservoirs are at full capacity. Compared to the last 10 years average, which means the Rabi output is also going to be robust. So overall, for this financial year, we expect that the agricultural output is going to be robust. There have been some, of course, from this story, from this overall positive story, there are some negative stories. That is, with some excess rainfall in some regions, which resulted in vegetables crops, especially crops like potatoes and onions being affected. As a result, they had a detrimental impact, inflationary impact, but it does not show up in the wholesale price index, but retail inflation, as you know, shot up for potatoes, onions, and tomatoes. We talk more about that later in the inflation. So the key message is that agriculture is overall a very positive story, and we expect the rest of the financial year also to be positive. Then we come to industry. This graph is very telling. As you can see, that this is showing you the gross value added of industry. And in our industry growth, which consists of 4 sectors: manufacturing, construction, mining, and electricity, gas, and water utilities. Together, what we find is that industrial growth was already slowing down in India from the quarter 17-18 quarter 4. And when we look at the data closer to 19-20 quarter 3, industrial growth almost stagnated. But of course, the pandemic made everything worse, where there was a deep dive. There was a sharp contraction of industrial output by 38% in the first quarter. And then in the second quarter, we actually improved growth by industrial growth actually improved itself by 2%. So the V shape that Dr. Mundle laid out is very much visible here. And this is a story that we keep on coming back to as we even show the leading indicators from high frequency indicators from the latter quarter, from quarter 3. Specifically, there's one store that another key message that's not shown in this graph is the subsectors. The sector which was affected the most amongst the four sectors that we mentioned was the construction sector, which actually the growth contracted by 50%. In contrast, electricity, gas, and water supply was the least affected. It contracted by only 7% in quarter one. Part of the reason was that these were mostly essential services, and therefore they were exempted from lockdown. In quarter two, we see a sharp recovery, which was actually led by electricity, gas, and water supply, and even by 4.4% growth. And even manufacturing, which is the largest subsector, also recorded positive growth of 0.6%. So overall, we see a recovery in quarter two. Now, what does it tell us about quarter three? Index of industrial production and the IIP data, which is one of the key indicators of industrial growth. For October, it shows that the IIP data again shows the V-shaped recovery after June. Then there's after June, we see a shallow, the growth actually shallowing out. And after September, for the first 1 month that is available, we see positive growth in manufacturing and positive growth in IIP, but the growth seems to be moderating or plateauing. This growth is also broad-based, essentially that all the sectors, use-based classification sectors, consumer durables, non-durables, capital goods, have seen positive growth. Almost all of them, if not at least, they have seen a recovery in their growth patterns. And October data definitely are positive, that almost all of them are showing positive growth in October. Even the core IIP number, which is the green dotted line, has also shown sharp V-shaped recovery after April and became shallower after June. But again, here, if you pick up the pattern, after September, we see a plateauing out of core IIP growth. All the IIP indices, general, manufacturing, and core, are telling us that there was a V-shaped recovery till June, which became shallower thereafter. But the story is mixed when we come to October. So when we go to more high-frequency data other than IIP, which is we look at some indicators like electricity demand, GST collection, and our PMI manufacturing. When we look at electricity demand, which is a red dashed line, this is showing that in October and November, we see that industrial recovery actually plateaued. There was a marginal pickup in the first 15 days of December data. But GST collection also has plateaued after the initial V-shaped recovery, and even the shallow growth patterns due to plateau. It's when we look at PMI manufacturing, it's the same story again, which is a green line, which is the same story again, where we find that there has been plateauing out of the growth. So this actually calls into question the sustainability of growth, and something we'll come back to again. Now, from the second, after talking about agriculture and industry, we're going to talk about services. Like the industry, we see that this is the gross value added of the services sector. Services sector had a mixed growth pattern till 18-19 quarter four, and after 18-19, we see that services sector also slowed down. But it's again due to the pandemic and the lockdown associated with the pandemic, we see a sharp contraction in quarter one of 21%, and then in quarter two there's a V-shaped recovery where the services sector recovers by 11%. But there's much variation in the services sectors. The services sectors, the fall and the recovery or moderation and contraction was led by the sector trade, hotels, restaurants, and communication, which saw contraction of 47% in the first quarter, and then it moderated to 15%. But however, the story is not uniform here when we look at the other two subsectors of the services sector, which is mainly financial, real estate, and professional services, and defense and public administration, defense, and other services. What we find there is there was while financial, real estate, and professional services only contracted by 5.3%, it's actually worsened in Q2, where it contracted further by 8.1%. Similarly, with public administration, defense, and other services, its growth rate actually worsened to 12.2%. So the stories are not uniform, and we know that contact intensive sectors are going to pose a constraint to recovery in this sector. When we look at high frequency indicators, we look at some subsectors from Q3. The transport sector is a good story, but it also tells you this mixed patterns that we are getting within the subsectors, sub-service sectors. What we find here is that this is it's very obvious. On the left-hand side, we are showing you the cargo transport across various modes: air, railways, and major ports. On the right-hand side, we are showing you the passenger traffic of two modes: airways and railways. What you find here is on the left-hand side, there's a nice V-shaped recovery and till June, and then there's a shallowing out of growth. And again, the story that we have said, there's a plateauing out of growth in November. Railways traffic in particular showed very robust growth of 15%, but in November it's showing that it's plateauing out. And even cargo ports actually showed a 3% growth in November. So it's a very good story of recovery. But on the other hand, if you see the right-hand side axis of the passenger traffic, what we find is that while there's a sort of a V-shape in April, but the recovery has been much slower, and it continues to have a protracted slowdown. When we look at other high frequency indicators from the service sectors, the number of e-way bills is another signal. And there again, we find recovery, shallowing out of recovery, and then a plateauing in Q3, as you can see from October and November. When we look at Google mobility indicators, it's a similar story. The main story is that the retail and recreation, the grocery and pharmacy story is the only one which is actually positive from what it was in January, February. The deviation is positive. That means it's growing more than what it was January and February, and it continues to stay positive, but it is again a flat horizontal line. So from what we see is there's recovery, but it's not sustaining. It's a very similar story across industry and services. The third picture then we talk about is on the demand side. It's not on the supply side. On demand side, one key story that we pick up and talk about is exports of goods and services and imports on goods of services. What this tells you, this is a similar story where we find that exports and imports were actually already declining from January onwards. But after falling, contracting, reaching its bottom and trough in April, it recovered, sharply recovered. But again, after June, we see a shallowing out of growth, and we see a plateauing out again in Q3. This V-shaped recovery of exports and imports is actually mostly driven by goods export, where the goods recovery, the goods exports have shown more volatile growth patterns. But as services exports and imports contraction has been relatively flat at 9%. So both, this story is led by goods story rather than the services story. The services story is just negative. And even in October and November, we had the export story is another key message is that in the first half of the year, as you can see from the red line and the green line, exports was higher than imports, which means we had a trade surplus throughout the first half. Which is, but from October and November onwards, again, imports is greater than exports, which means that that trade surplus is going away and we are back to deficit. A deficit has re-emerged in October. So this is the key story here, that the difference between the first half and what the second half holds for us. What does the outlook? What does the outlook say about trade patterns? The trade outlook is uncertain. Various reasons for that. Firstly, as we know that the global impetus, growth impetus of gradual rollout of COVID-19 vaccines, and incoming new US administration, this would result in a more positive and cooperative global approach, which will most likely boost exports. But on the other hand, we know that there are fresh lockdowns in Europe and the US following a second wave of coronavirus, which may dampen export recovery. However, there's another internal story, our way of perceiving internal story, which is the story about the recent regional trade agreements. The one which we are not a part of was the recent RCEP agreement. By choosing not to be a part of it, we are actually 28. The data shows from April to September that 28% of our goods exports come from our RCEP member countries, from our major destinations. For India, accounting for 28% of total goods export. So there's a likelihood that the recent agreements not being participant there may affect our exports, have a negative impact there, and the RCEP countries may choose to import these goods from other countries. Though the door still remains open for India to join RCEP if its issues are adequately addressed, but it remains a challenge for India in the short run, where we do need to revive demand. If the incoming US administration revives the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that may be another option for India. But if we choose to stay out of both of these mega RTAs, it will be very damaging for India, both in the medium to long run, as global supply chains are increasingly embedded within such regional trade agreements. So we need to think about resisting autarkic pressures and introducing reforms to significantly strengthen our own competitiveness. Beyond the trade policy, when we come to our foreign investment flows, what we find is the data here, firstly, is from the Reserve Bank of India. Until 1 o'clock today afternoon, we had the data only till September. So we have to use alternative data from NSDL to see the data for quarter 3. But what we find is that overall, if you look at the first half, foreign investment inflows actually grew by 7.5% in the first half of the current financial. However, as we can see very clearly, they have been very volatile, both portfolio flows and foreign direct investment. In the first quarter, there were hardly any flows, and even in the second quarter, it's only in August we see a massive inflow. However, what we find in October and November, that portfolio inflows, for which data is available from NSDL, portfolio inflows have surged during October to mid-December, and their the flows are to the tune of USD 19 billion. So this is going to affect our story as I go on to the next slide. The next slide, this slide is showing you the foreign exchange reserves, which are the green bars, and the red line is your foreign exchange rate. As you can see very clearly, our foreign exchange reserves have actually increased, has been rising since July last year. And after April, they have seen a very sharp rise, reflecting a growing balance of payment surplus. Now, the question is, what has been driving this foreign exchange reserves? As we go out, if you remember the story, we had of current account or trade surplus in the first half of the year, which has actually driven our current account surplus. Actually, our foreign capital flows were negative, or zero, but current account was positive. So that's the very interesting story that we see in the first half. In the second half, our foreign exchange reserves are still risen up, probably not as fast as in November, December. But, and that has been driven mostly by portfolio investment rather than current account. So because we just mentioned that portfolio investment surged in quarter 3 to the tune of 19 billion. Now, while foreign exchange reserves have gone up, when we discuss the reasons, what has been the impact on the economy? The impact has been on the exchange rate, where our exchange has risen to led to appreciation of the nominal exchange rate. Once, not only that, adjusting for India's high inflation, we find that even our real effective exchange rate has appreciated, that even more than the nominal. What does that imply for the economy? it means that exchange rate appreciation will affect exports because it makes exports more expensive, therefore affecting our trade balance. Plus, the increase in reserves will also affect it will also affect our money supply, and therefore it will increase money supply, and therefore it will add to inflationary pressures. So there are, while it's a positive news, on one hand that our foreign exchange reserves have gone up, they can have negative impact on the economy, and we need to be conscious of that. So with that, the story comes to end on the real sector, where we talk about the agriculture, industry, services, and trade. And now I pass it on to my colleague to Rudrani. Dr. Rudrani Bhattacharya is going to speak about inflation. Thank you. No, stop. So,
Rudrani.
So one story on the demand side, what we find is that we are still we are characterized by weak demand, as domestic demand is also quite weak because it is shown by falling imports, and external demand is weak because of weak exports. And not only that, in addition, what we find is that the RBI Consumer Confidence Survey from November shows the consumer sentiments are quite weak, at least compared to last year. Compared to April, they are much better compared to last year. So, on to Rudrani.
Thanks, Monali. On the price side, headline CPI inflation has been persistently higher than the RBI's tolerance band of 2 to 6% since April 2020. The main drivers of this high and persistent inflation have been the food inflation, and within the food basket, it's the vegetables, mainly onion, potato, onion, and tomato prices. Those who have been driving the inflationary pressure. Now, the onion prices started surging from last year due to abnormal rainfall in the onion producing states, and during the initial months, the Kharif months of 2020, there has been increase in the demand for agricultural laborers, which led to a rise in the agricultural wages, a sharp jump in the agricultural wages from May from 4.7% to June in around 6.6%. And even there has been a larger jump in rural non-agricultural wages. So this rise in agricultural wages actually even added to the cost of agricultural production, and that led to the inflationary pressure in the other food commodities, other commodities in the vegetable basket. However, if we take out those components like potato, onion, and tomato, then the rest of the food basket has been growing at a 8 to 6.6%. Whereas including those components, we found that it's the food inflation has been in double digit, around sticky around 10% during this entire period. So in one hand, we had the pressure from CPI food sector. On the other hand, CPI core inflation has been also been sticky. Although it was lower than the upper level of the tolerance band, around 5%. It was sticky around 5%. But if we look at what are the components that's driving the core inflation, we'll see that it's the miscellaneous component, which includes like health, transport, and personal care. And there has been while the components like clothing and footwear, those components were showing a steady inflation rate of around 5%. This miscellaneous components and the miscellaneous basket is around 28% of the total CPI basket. So transport and personal care, these two has jumped to double-digit inflation rate, which has led the miscellaneous inflation higher than the 6% level. So during the lockdown, there has been complete disruption of the transportation system, and also the personal care is some sort of a services which requires which has higher risk of transmission of the diseases. So these are the sectors which have been affected during the pandemic mostly, and that's why the prices in these services have increased quite a lot. This red solid line is the CPI headline inflation, and the broken red line, the food inflation, showing it has been in the double-digit range for this entire period. If we look at the dynamics of the WPI inflation, which is WPI total, showing the big broken lines, green lines, we see the movement, the pattern of the movement in WPI is also following the pattern in the movement in WPI food inflation, which is the small broken green line. But we see a period from say March 2020 to July 2020. There has been a period when WPI inflation, WPI prices shows a deflation. So that's the period when WPI actually deviated from CPI quite a lot, although that pattern of deviation is narrowing down in the later periods. So what are the reasons why that led the WPI to deviate from CPI? So WPI, first of all, food has a higher share in the WPI basket, in the CPI basket, which led to a higher rise in the CPI inflation led by the food inflation. Again, because of the logistic disruptions during the lockdown, there has been the wholesale activities were less affected compared to the retail activities, which led to the rising prices of the retail commodities, and that led to a higher trade margin between the WPI wholesale and retail activities. Another reason which led to this deviation is we can take into account is that the large deflation in the crude oil prices. So during this this entire period, there has been crude oil inflation where crude oil prices were showing up a deflation of around 30 to 40%, which showed a higher transmission to WPI energy, leading to the WPI energy prices to a deflation, and that also pulled down the aggregate WPI prices. On the other hand, this crude oil deflation had a very low and slow transmission to CPI energy. So CPI energy, although it's also declining, but still there we have not observed any deflation in CPI energy prices. So what are our Mundle, next slide please. So what are we expecting about inflation in this quarter and the coming and the last quarter of the financial year 2021? We we project inflation using a co-integrated vector autoregression model, where we use different indicators such as the different components of CPI, that is CPI food, CPI core, CPI energy, and aggregate CPI, WPI food and WPI energy, money supply, interest rate, and inflation expectation of households published by RBI, the survey-based inflation expectations 3 months ahead. So the year-on-year changes in all these indicators are non-stationary and they are co-integrated. So we estimate a co-integrated VAR model. And our forecast for December 2020 is for the headline CPI inflation is 6.6%. So we predict that CPI in Q3 2021, CPI headline inflation will be 7%. It will moderate to 6.3% in Q4 2021, and over the year it will remain around 6.7%, which is still higher, the upward level of the tolerance band of RBI. So we have different factors. There are upward risk and downward risk. Those are playing on prices. The factors which can pull down inflation in the next quarters are, in one hand, the vegetables prices have been moderated significantly because of with the arrival of the winter crops. And the crude oil is still showing a deflation, and that is still transmitting to CPI energy inflation, which is still reducing. So these are the factors which can pull down CPI headline inflation. But on the other hand, there are factors like rural wages, which is as I already discussed, that rural wages show a big jump from April, May to June, July, and that can act as a both pulling the rural demand and increasing the agricultural cost, and can have a increasing effect on the food prices. But on the other hand, we have household inflation expectation will see a slightly moderation, so that can also pull down this headline inflation. So these are the upward risk and downward risk that we have. But overall, we expect that inflation will remain moderately above the higher range of the tolerance band of RBI. So that's the end of the inflation story. So it's me. Sorry, you have to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I was saying that we've had a very granular description of what is driving inflation. And before that, Bornali gave us again, a very detailed picture of the situation in the real sector as well as the external sector. Now, what does all that add up to in terms of the outlook going forward and the overall picture in terms of GDP? The graph here you see on the left-hand side, those bars which you have to read off from the left to the rupees still in the absolute levels. And you see that there was a very sharp decline during Q1, which we're all familiar with. But then a very sharp recovery also during Q2 of this year, much sharper than most of us had expected. And based on that, we have now made our forecasts, which actually have been revised. Earlier, we were expecting a much lower pace of recovery. We now see that after that sharp dive and that quick recovery during Q2, the contraction compared to the previous year, the level of output of the previous year is just 7.5%. And we expect from our forecast that this will now be eliminated by Q3. There will be marginally some positive growth. And in Q4, we are actually expecting that output will grow by about 2% compared to the corresponding output level in the previous year. Now, all that translates into, for the year as a whole, a decline of about 7.3% in GDP. In other words, in level terms, going down from 146 lakhs crores real GDP to that was last year to 135 lakh crores this year. Lakh crores is also a trillion. Now, as I remarked at the outset, this of course, this recovery is being driven certainly by the easing of supply side constraints, but these have also been helped, pulled along by stimulation policies on the demand side, and we'll discuss that more going forward. Yeah. Before I get to those macro policy discussions, this is something I want to discuss in some detail, because here we are trying to capture what do we expect to be the long-term effects, so what we call hysteresis, of this very sharp negative shock. You see there at 2021 is the bottom. That's where we are going to start off next year. And we have plotted a number of alternative growth paths over there. The green line, which actually doesn't have that contraction at all, is what we call a counterfactual no pandemic shock growth path. That is, if the pandemic hadn't happened, where would we have been? And that is the pre-existing trend growth path of about 5.8% per year, recent trend. That's just projected forward. And we take that as a benchmark against which we are comparing a number of alternative paths. First, path 2, which we call a highly optimistic path, we assume that here the catch-up will be very rapid. That is, by the end of 21-22, end of next financial year, we will have caught up because of the very strong boosting effect, because the pull down that we've suffered this year, get that strong kick of the base effect. And if output grows by about 14% next year, we would have caught up with our 19-20 level by then. And then we assume continuing robust growth of about 7% per year. Now, we don't think this can happen. It's just looking at a scenario. But even with this path, we only catch up with the no pandemic path we would have been on by 26-27. So this gives you a flavor of how even that 1 year big shock, the long-term effects of this. Path 3 that we look at, and we call this a pessimistic path, is that we don't catch up within 1 year with the 2019-20 output level. We only catch up in 2 years, that is by 22-23, which will entail average growth of about 7% during these 2 years. And then we continue to grow at something below 5% in the long term. This, of course, never catches up with the no pandemic path. And it's a possible scenario, for instance, if we mess up the way we roll out our vaccine when they arrive next year, or the economy is mismanaged and so on, you can get into a low growth path. It's a possible scenario. What we think is really a more realistic path is that we will catch up within 1 year by the end of 21-22 with the 2019-20 output level, and then continue to grow, not at the same very high rate, but at the old trend rate of about 5.8%. This is the blue line that you're seeing over there. Now, the reality will obviously remain somewhere in that range between the no pandemic path and the very pessimistic path. Ours is somewhere in the middle, which we expect what we call is the realistic path. But the important thing to note is that even to get to that path and certainly get beyond that to really catch up quickly with the no pandemic path, conventional, fiscal and monetary sort of policies will not do. You will need to give a strong positive shock through wide-ranging reforms in the financial sector, in the power sector, which lies behind part of the crisis in the financial sector, and in foreign trade, where we have been stepping back in recent years. Also, and here we will need center-state cooperation, because these are state subjects. You do need urgent reforms in sectors like education, health, labor, and land. Now, with that background, let me move in specifically to zone in on the fiscal policy story. Here, it's very unfortunate that in the last 3 years or so, there has been a very significant deterioration in our fiscal marksmanship. That is, how closely the budget is able to anticipate what is really likely to happen. You will see there that in the graph there, in the year 2015-16, actually our projection of receipts in the budget, the actuals were actually a little higher than it was projected in the budget. So we were doing better than the budget had anticipated. But subsequently, it has grown lower and lower and lower. These are all deviations from the budget estimates, I should clarify. And by the time you get to 2019-20, you're falling short of the budget estimate of receipts of tax revenues by as much as 18%. You see exactly the same story when you take all receipts together, non-debt receipts, that is the green line there, which puts together tax revenue, center's share, as well as non-tax revenues. And there again, you find that while the actual was better than what was budgeted in 15-16, by the time you get to 2019-20, we are falling short by as much as 16%. You put both those facts together, and you find that you've got a huge increase in the fiscal deficit, which is now exceeding the budget estimate by as much as 33% in 2019-20. Now, this is a very bad situation. Begins while we are wildly off the charts that we were in terms of our budgeting forecast. But this is all that's happened even before the pandemic hit us. Now look at what has happened after the pandemic hit us. You see there the red lines give you what was the story last year. This is all data up to April, October, which is what we have at the moment from the CGA for revenues and expenditure. So we're comparing April, October this year with last year, the green line against the red line. And you see that on the revenue receipt side, there have been large shortfalls in tax revenue, in non-tax revenue, and in total tax revenue. We're down from about 9 trillion last year to only 7 trillion this year. As against that, the expenditure in this period, April, October, and this is just for the central government, as I clarified, is almost exactly the same as it was last year. So no contraction there. Obviously, then the consequence is a huge increase in the fiscal deficit. It's gone up from around 7 trillion for this period to over 10 trillion now. In other words, it's ballooned by about 32% compared to the same period last year. And this, of course, as I said, expenditure levels have been maintained, and to finance that, given the shortfall in revenues, the central government took an active decision to undertake a very large volume of post-budget borrowing, that is borrowing additional to what was already planned for in the budget. A quick look at what's been happening on the expenditure side. As I said, the overall level has remained exactly the same as last year. However, within that, there are large changes. there have been a large number of departments, ministries, where there's been a large contraction, and others where there's been, and among these I have include this is the last bullet over there. There are things like power, human resource development, that's education, and even food department, because much of the food subsidy now has been shifted off budget. As against that, there are other sectors, especially those which provide income support, such as rural development and agriculture, where there's been a large increase in expenditure. Those are the green line, the green arrows being shown there at the lower part of that chart, as well as, of course, health and family welfare, naturally, given that we are trying to cope with this pandemic, and also telecommunications and transport. The total is small. The amount of increase is very large because there's rolling out of networks for BSNL and so on. Going back to the overall fiscal deficit story, it's been widely believed that the government provided very little stimulus. But to some extent, I think this is really a communication failure. This was some miscommunication of what actually was going on, because there was a lot of projection on the Atmanirbhar Bharat program, as you know, and it was being projected as a very large program amounting to 20 trillion or something like 10% of GDP and so on. But when this was actually, people looked at it carefully, analysts and the media and so on, they found that only 1% of it was really an additional fiscal spending. And that's why the whole message got distorted, that the government wasn't doing anything very much and so on. Of course, subsequently, Atmanirbhar Bharat fiscal component has been expanded to about 2.4%, but that's not the real story. The real story is that the combined fiscal deficit of the center and states, and that's the table that you see on the left-hand side. Please look at the last column there. That's the fiscal deficit as measured against our forecast of the GDP, which I mentioned earlier. So the fiscal deficit of the center, that is 3.9% already there in the budget. The level was there. The percentage has, of course, gone up because the denominator has shrunk. Post-budget additional borrowing, 2.3%. Then that Atmanirbhar Bharat component of 2.4%. And then you have to add to that the fiscal deficit of the states, which again, though it was budgeted at 2.8% originally, has now, because of the shrunken GDP, it actually works out to 3.1%. And then now additional headroom, borrowing headroom has been provided to the states. This is going to can add another 2.2% to the fiscal deficit. So adding all that together, we are actually looking at a fiscal deficit of about 29 trillion, which would work out to about 14% of the GDP as forecast by both RBI and by us. The difference is actually very small in our forecast. The RBI forecasts a decline of 7.5% in GDP. We are forecasting a decline of 7.2%. And most other forecasts are also more or less in the same ballpark. So actually quite a lot has been done. But the question is it enough? There is, of course, a widespread view that even this 14% is not adequate, because in fact, if you look at the data on aggregate demand, the release for the second quarter by MOSPI, you see that government expenditure actually has declined by more than 22%. So how do you explain this? You see, the center had decided to maintain its expenditure levels as in the budget, and as I said, it engaged in large borrowing to maintain that. However, the state governments could not, because they also suffered the same loss in revenue in the first half of the year. But they could not replace this by additional borrowing because they were still bound by the FRBM borrowing limits, which are hard budget constraints. So the big shortfall in state spending. state government spending in the first half of the year, and it accounts for that compression, the overall compression in total government spending that you see in the national accounts. Now, this is likely to change hopefully in the second half of the year, because now the states have been given some additional headroom, borrowing headroom, on which agreement has been reached, especially under the in the GST Council on the compensations, financing of the compensation scheme for GST shortfalls and the extension of the scheme till all the money is paid off and so on. So that's one of the reasons, the fact that we believe that 14% really is not going to cut it, it's not enough. A further point, of course, and this is a somewhat technical point, that the real stimulus is not the total fiscal deficit, but what we call the fiscal impulse. That is the change in the deficit in this financial year compared to the last financial year. Now, all that being said, the fact remains that even this fiscal impulse actually works out to 7% of GDP. Now you combine that with the RBI's liquidity infusion amounting to well over 6% of GDP. And this actually adds up to a fairly substantial stimulus, fiscal plus monetary, and it compares quite favorably with most emerging market economies. And we also have to remember, while it is all very well to root for more stimulus, that what has already been done has been translating into fairly strong inflationary pressures. As was discussed earlier, we are remaining above the tolerance band of the RBI, and the Monetary Policy Committee actually focused on this in its report. All of them were very concerned about this. Also, it has been exercising considerable pressure on financial markets, as we shall see later. So there's a trade-off. You can spend more, but it does have implications. But apart from the level, there are other issues on which the assessment can give you, as it were, a somewhat negative report card for what the central government did. One is in terms of the timing. The extra spending could certainly have been better front-loaded. It took a long time before the center actually got its act together and realized what it really needed to do was not this and that incentive to other people, but really to put money in the hands of those who had been adversely affected by losing their livelihoods following the lockdown. So this could have been better front-loaded. Another point, of course, as I said earlier, the extra borrowing provision headroom for borrowing by states that has now been provided could have certainly been done much earlier and front-loaded, because after all, it is the states, not the center, which accounts for 2/3 of total government spending in this country. And mind you, all the services are actually delivered by state governments. Even on central government schemes, the central government doesn't have a setup to deliver services, to people. It all ultimately has to go through the state governments, who may be acting as agents of the central government. And certainly they are the front line when it comes to trying to contain the pandemic, to provide relief for that, income support. So that was certainly a major failure, not providing enough support to states early enough. And finally, on the composition of expenditure, while something has been done to provide income support to poor households, it could have been much more than actually has been done for those who have lost their livelihoods. Now, that being said, what could be the correct stance for fiscal policy in the year ahead, namely in the budget that is being prepared even as we speak? It's really a tough call, because there's a tension here between what you need to do in terms of the long-term, growth prospects and the cost of doing that. So let me just walk you through that. We saw earlier that the adverse long-term effects of that negative contraction will have very long-term effects. And this makes it urgent actually to do things that will push us back to a high growth path quickly. On the other hand, what has already been done is translating into elevated inflation. And I have to say that most of that spending has not even happened yet. It's going to happen in these 3-4 months till the end of this financial year. But already inflationary pressures are up. The yields on government securities have stayed high, as I'm going to talk about in a little while, and that's crowding out credit flow to the private sector. Also, this sharp increase in public debt as a consequence of this additional borrowing, of course, that's translating into higher debt servicing costs, and this will further crowd out productive public expenditure. And so for all these reasons, while there are arguments to provide more fiscal stimulus, there are also arguments of fiscal restraint. So this is a challenging situation. It's a tough call, as I said. What do you do? Well, fortunately, the fact that we expect a high growth rate during next year, this kick that we're going to get, the base effect of the big shortfall this year. If you set your growth target is high enough in real terms to sustain the recovery, but lower than the GDP growth in nominal terms, then actually what would happen is, since roughly the buoyancy, that is the revenue, increase in revenue as a consequent increase in nominal GDP, is roughly 1, so it's proportionate increase. So revenue is likely to grow the same rate as nominal GDP, but if you keep your expenditure growth high in real term, but lower than that nominal growth, then gradually your fiscal deficit would be coming down. Let me just fix ideas, an example here. Suppose we assume that real growth would be of the order of 10%. That, by the way, is a forecast a lot of people are making, 10% or more for next year. We are also in that same, we are also making similar forecasts. And let's say the inflation control measures are effective and is brought down within the range to, let's say, 5%. These are just hypothetical example. So you get a nominal GDP growth of 15%. Buoyancy of 1 means revenue will also grow at 15%. Now, if you set your expenditure growth target, that is total government, I'm talking about center plus states. So this requires a lot of coordination between the center and states. Suppose you were to set that at about 12%, then obviously you will gradually be reducing your deficit. If you repeat this year over year through your 3-year rolling plans of the medium-term fiscal framework. So while supporting growth, you would also be gradually bringing down the deficit. Now, a question can be asked that will this really support the recovery? Because after all, you are reducing what I call the fiscal impulse, that is the difference in the current year's deficit compared to the previous year. Now, we must remember here in this context that the fiscal program, that is the spending program of the government, is not the only driver of growth. There are other powerful spenders. First of all, there's the continuing liquidity infusion that the RBI can provide to enable this fiscal consolidation. It was one of the main drivers of demand this year, and that can continue, maybe in a somewhat moderated form going forward. Then there's this positive developments I referred to earlier that's emerging on the pandemic front. Let's keep our fingers crossed. Let's hope that actually happens. And if that happens and the vaccine is successfully rolled out in India, this could certainly give a big boost to growth. Third, we have seen some uptick in investment and exports already in Q2, and that could continue through Q4, through the rest of this financial year and hopefully into next year. Finally, and most importantly, it is very important. None of this by themselves may do the job, but you do need game-changing structural reforms to restore a high growth path. Our first priority, we will argue why, is the financial sector. But to do that, you need also to have strong reforms in power. You certainly need to get strong reforms in foreign trade to reverse the autarkic tendencies, a protectionist tendency which have been setting in the last 3 years. We would need urgent additional reforms in areas like health, education, land, and labor. But for those, you would need strong cooperation between the center and the states. Let me move on to the monetary policy story. You see there on the left-hand side that huge increase in government borrowing. The green dashed line is central borrowing. The black dotted line is the state's borrowing. As you can see, it was very muted until October. Now it has started increasing. And the red line is the total borrowing, massive increase. On the right-hand side graph, you see what it is doing to the cost of money or the yields. This is the top black line there, dotted line, is the yield on state government bonds, what are called state development loans. And those have hardly come down. They've remained, more or less fixed around 6.5%, 6.6% or so. The lower dashed green line is the yield on the central government's 10-year security, and this is very important. This is the benchmark security, and that also has not come down. But it has to be said that it also has not gone up as a consequence of all this borrowing, and this is partly because of measures that the RBI has been taking. It's not succeeded in bringing it down, but at least it's prevented the yields of shooting up, including for the state governments. The first time the RBI engaged in open market operations in purchases of the state development loans following the introduction of the expanded state borrowing program. Now here you see the what's been happening because of all the actions being taken by the RBI. It has, as you know, it has kept the policy rate fixed after April at 4%, and then somewhat lower than that, the reverse repo rate. And the short maturity government paper, the 91 Treasury bill, the 362 Treasury bill, they are actually very closely tracking the policy rate. But if you look at that green line on top, that's what I talked about earlier, the 10-year GSEC, that unfortunately has not, it's not gone up, but it's not come down either, despite all the efforts that have been made very energetically, I have to say, by the RBI. It introduced the targeted long-term repo operations, the twist open market operations, then a relaxation in the mark-to-market rules, and raising the limits on hold maturity bonds under the statutory liquidity ratio. And there are a few others also, but these are the main ones. But despite that, it's not been able to successfully bring down the long-dated yield. But it has been reasonably, has had some effect on improved transmission. It was very sticky earlier, but now you see that this is now the banking sector. The term deposit rates on deposits over 1 year have come down by about 1.5% or a little more than that. And then that blue line there is the weighted average lending rate on new loans being given by the banks. And that has also come down by about 1.5 percentage points. So some success over there. Looking at the composition of what's been happening to lending rates, the segment of the banking sector where it has come down the most of the foreign banks came down from 8.4 to about 7%. Their weighted average lending rate. For the private sector banks as a whole, that's come down by a little over from 10.2 to 9.0%. It hasn't come down very much in the case of public sector banks. It's remained hovering around 8%. But that 8% actually is lower than what was its present rate is really not much higher than that of foreign banks and lower than private sector banks. So it hasn't lowered it much, but it was low to begin with compared to the other segments. So that's the story on what's been happening on the transmission of the policy rate into bank lending rates and so on. Unfortunately, while the cost of money has come down somewhat, the credit flow has remained very constrained. The growth of bank credit to commercial sector, you can see from the blue line there, has been persistently coming down. Little wiggles up and down, but basically it's a downward trend, as you can see over there. On the right-hand side, it's again showing the loans to different segments of borrowers. The biggest amount is, of course, loans, personal loans, but a big dip comparing the red bar to the green bar, big dip there, even in personal loans. And in most other segments, there has been a large dip, some increase in services. And the biggest increase you see here is in medium industry. We think it is more an appearance than reality, because there's been some definitional change of what is large industry and what is medium industry. And so this may be just a statistical curiosity rather than a real change. The disturbing part is that the loans to micro and small enterprises, which were declining in absolute terms last year, have continued to decline this year. You can see that red line and the red bar and the little green bar for micro small enterprises, both sort of minus, below zero. So this is the challenging part of what's been happening to credit flows. With that background, now looking a little bit at the outlook and policy options and so on, the main thing to note is that for a fragile financial sector burdened with this huge volume of non-performing assets and so on, whether it can actually handle this massive increase in government borrowing this year is a question. Probably some partial monetization may be required. In many ways, it is this thing that is the biggest threat to macroeconomic stability in our view, but it's also a very hard problem to crack. In terms of reforms, strengthening bank supervision to contain imprudent lending is a very high priority. I think some efforts are being made by the RBI on this. But if banking supervision had been what it ought to be, we would never have got into this problem of high NPAs and multiple scams in banks and NBFCs in the first place. Certainly, a first port of call for reforms is strengthening supervision. Then again, stronger rather than weaker implementation of the insolvency and bankruptcy code and the and institutions and arrangements like the NCAER and others to enable the cleaning up of bank balance. There's been some pressures by interested parties to weaken the implementation of the IBC and so on. This needs to be resisted and strengthened, actually, the implementation to make the cleaning up of bank balance sheets effective. Recently, there's been RBI internal working committee has submitted a report suggesting that we open up provide bank license to industrial conglomerates. We need to be extremely careful on this, as many experts and former governors of the RBI have been writing. We need to be very careful, because once you open this up to conglomerate, there's likely to be imprudent lending to group companies of those conglomerates. And this would create an uneven playing field compared to other conglomerates. A better route, in our view, which for some reason is just not being looked at, is the big elephant in the room, is to divest something like 51% of, not to divest, sorry, I correct myself, not to sell public sector equity in government equity banks, but to expand their equity base and sell that to the public so that you mobilize a huge volume of capital. And at the same time, if the total equity base is raised such that the government share comes down to 49%, this means technically a complete change in the governance structure of these banks and would put them at par with private banks. So from our point of view, this should be the big priority for reforms in the banking sector. Finally, new banking licenses could certainly be granted to non-bank finance companies, which have had a very robust track record. They have domain knowledge, and if they have acquired sufficient scale to be given licenses as full banks. Some of the private banks, some of the best private banks did start out as NBFCs and have got licenses now, and that would be a good way to go. Let me stop there now. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sudipto and Mundle, from the chat and the Q&A that's coming through. Clearly, there's a great deal of interest, both in the conclusions that you've come up with, but also some of the methodology and the issues. And I hope we can get to responding to those chat questions and insights as we go. Let's turn now to Aditi Nair, who's Vice President and Principal Economist at ICRA. Her focus has always been on macro. She has been one of the most clear, cited, and also direct commentators, and we've all appreciated her commentary. So over to you, Aditi.
Thank you, Shekhar, and good evening to everyone. And I must congratulate the entire NCAER team on an extremely comprehensive presentation and an update on the Indian economy. Dr. Mundle, Rudrani, and Bornali, that was a very, very comprehensive discussion from your side. If you will permit me, I will share my screen. I have some slides that I would like to show, just because we are a little less optimistic in some ways than some of the macro forecasts that you have put up. So I would like to just share my screen. Just give me a minute to be able to find the screen that I need to show you. I hope my screen is visible.
Yes. Yes, it is. Thank you.
Thank you. So just at the outset, I will first comment on what I found a little less optimistic in terms of my growth forecast and my outlook for the economy. And then I will go into the detailed slides that I have. So for this year, we are looking at a contraction of around 7.8%. And in fact, we are expecting the recession to end only in the next quarter, not in the current quarter. For the following year, we are looking at a GDP growth of around 8 to 8.5%. And while the CPI inflation may well be in the 5% range, 5 to 6% range, we do still think that the WPI inflation will be on the more muted side. So perhaps the nominal GDP growth maybe, it will of course be in double digits, but we expect it to be lower than what was indicated during the presentation. And on the medium term outlook, we now expect the potential growth for the Indian economy to be closer to 5 to 5.5%. So a little less optimistic than path 4. Let me just put it that way. Now, if you permit me, I will go into my slides. So here we have a comparison of the Indian economy with a lot of the major economies. So what you can see in April to June 2020 is this very sharp decline in the Indian GDP, much worse than what we saw in many of the other economies, but really not surprising given the kind of lockdown that we had. After that, we have a sharper than expected recovery in Q2 as compared to Q1, better than expected performance, and a better performance than some of the other large economies. So not a complete revival, and but still in terms of the pace of the recovery, I think we got a very good performance in Q2. Now moving on to Q3, the main event in Q3 every year is the festive season. This year we had a later start to the festive season than last year, and so there are lots and lots of base effects that we need to sort of trundle through to be able to understand really what the underlying growth momentum is in the ongoing quarter. So first of all, the one data point I think that has surprised me a lot in the last couple of weeks is how shallow the recovery was in the current situation index of the RBI's consumer confidence survey, which we take as a proxy for the urban consumer confidence. So there is an uptick, but the consumer confidence remains well below the pre-pandemic levels. This is something that to me is a little bit surprising in light of the kind of commentary that we've been seeing from corporates in various sectors. So what we've done, we've got a whole lot of data for October, November 2020. We've averaged it to get rid of all the base effects that I was talking about. And we have a growth in 10 out of 13 of these monthly indicators. So first of all, I'll start with what we think are clear and meaningful signals of a sustainable improvement. This is the growth in the GST e-way bills, very good double-digit growth, including also in rail freight, and a reasonable growth in petrol consumption. So these are free from base effects, and we think these are fairly meaningful in terms of the sustainability of the recovery. Then we have high growth in a number of indicators that has come on a sharp contraction last year. These we are discounting. So this is the entire auto space, also Coal India's output and electricity generation. So we're not taking away a whole lot from these 5 indicators. And then we have the indicators that have contracted: diesel consumption, vehicle registration, and ATF consumption. The decline in ATF consumption actually remained pretty steep even during the festive season. And this is just a reminder that the contact intensive parts of the economy are going to take a lot longer to recover than the rest of the economy. So it's a clear goods versus services, as one of you was talking about, that the goods part of the economy will recover and has recovered much faster than the services. And as I like to call it, it's materialism versus experiences. So since we can't have a lot of experiences right now, I think many of us that still have reasonably steady incomes are going in for more of the material benefits, and that's helping the goods sector to recover faster. But what is a little disconcerting is that we have 6 of these indicators where the volumes in October, November 2020 are lower than the level in October, November 2018. And some of it is a marginal difference, some of it is a more meaningful difference. But broadly, our takeaway is that a meaningful recovery remains distant. Now, in terms of the early data for December, I would term it cautiously optimistic. We got a pickup in the growth of electricity demand back to a 5% level in the first couple of weeks of December. Railway revenue carrying freight has seen an acceleration in the growth to 9.6%. Vehicle registrations in the first 18 days of this month were already at 66% of the full month of December 2019. And therefore, we expect that on a low base, we're going to get a much narrower contraction in December 2020 as compared to what we've seen in the last couple of months, which was 20% each. On the auto production side, things may be a little different because there are some indications of pent-up demand having fizzled out. There are also some supply chain issues that are cropping up in a couple of states. So we may have a very different pattern coming in on the registrations and on the auto production side in the month of December as compared to last month. For the generation of GST e-way bills, however, we have seen that the daily average data, which is available for the period up till the 13th of December, is a little bit lower than what we've seen in a similar period of the last 3 months. So this again may be an indicator that there is some amount of pent-up demand that has been satisfied temporarily, and that the supply chain issues are having an impact on the dispatches during this period. Now, in terms of volumes overall, we do expect there to be a tentative and an uneven recovery in volumes across the non-agricultural sectors in this quarter. But the concerns are that raw material prices are rising, as are salaries and hiring in some sectors. And therefore, the impact on profitability of the listed corporate space may actually get absorbed to some extent. So in Q1 and Q2, the sharp cost cutting that we saw, which was able to absorb a part of the volume decline, that trend will reverse in this quarter. Of course, it's highly debatable on a GVA basis. When we add back salaries, obviously that impact gets nullified. But the raw material cost is definitely something that we need to keep in mind. In Q1, raw material prices were very low. In Q2, even though prices had started going up, companies were sitting on a large inventory of lower priced which they had acquired at a lower price, and therefore that helped them to bolster their profitability. And this is something that is going to reverse in the current quarter. Now, I'll quickly look at our takeaway from the agricultural side. These are 2 charts that I like a lot. Reservoir storage is a little bit lower than last year, but it's still very healthy compared to the peaks of the previous 4 years. So this is something that we think is going to hold the agri economy in fairly good stead. As far as Rabi sowing is concerned, a huge part of last year's acre has already been covered with several weeks to go for additional sowing. And the YOY growth is around 5%. Last year, we almost got a 10% increase in the Rabi acreage. So we're not expecting the growth by the end of the season to be more than 1 to 2% on the acreage side. Having said that, the sowing has happened early this year, and with a very pretty healthy overall groundwater and moisture situation, we do think that the gross value addition in the agricultural sector is going to remain fairly steady even in H2, despite the fact that the base effect is unfavorable, especially for Q4. So our view is that we are going to see a 1% contraction in Q3 FY21. Agricultural growth will be steady. On the industrial side, particularly the commodity price increase is going to have a negative impact in terms of the extent to which there can be an improvement in Q3 as compared to the earlier quarters. And the services, the contact intensive services are going to remain constrained. We do think that especially central government spending is something that may turn around in Q3. We certainly expect it to turn around in Q4. But overall, we still think that there will be a small 1% contraction in Indian GDP in Q3. And that means that our view is that the recession is yet to end, unfortunately. However, if we look at the drivers of demand for the next quarter, basically in terms of consumption, between the healthy outlook for the Rabi sowing and the moisture situation, the MSP increase and the healthy expected increase in procurement, we think that farm demand is going to remain fairly favorable. With labor now coming back to the urban areas, the remittances will restart, and that's something that should help non-farm demand. And on the urban consumption side, we do think that a visibility of a pickup in economic activity and also the hope that full vaccine rollout is not too far away is something that is going to be able to boost the urban sentiment over the next quarter. Exports have dipped a little bit in the last couple of months because of the renewed restrictions that we've seen in some trading partners. But again, here the lockdowns that have been announced of late are obviously a concern. But over the next couple of months, we do see that the picture should turn around, especially with greater vaccine rollouts in the trading partners. For state governments, central government spending, the tax revenue visibility has improved a lot in the last couple of months. And this is something that we expect is going to allow for central government spending to be a lot faster in the last 5 months of this fiscal year as compared to what we've seen in the situation up till October. So in H1, as you all pointed out, we had a very flat situation as far as Government of India's total expenditure was concerned. But then we got a good step up in the YOY growth in the month of October. And now with the better tax inflows that have come in the festive season, and also the base effect which is there related to direct taxes because of the corporate tax cut last year. Excise duty inflows have been doing exceedingly well because of the cess increases that were brought in earlier this year. So we think that this visibility of the tax inflows is going to allow the central government to spend a lot more. Now, if you give me a minute over here, I'll just quickly talk about our forecast for Government of India's fiscal situation. So we are penciling in a total revenue shock of 6.5 trillion across the net tax revenues, the non-tax revenues, and the disinvestment. On the expenditure side, we actually expect the total expenditure to be almost as much as the budget estimates. So despite all the fiscal stimulus measures that have been announced, we think that at best, the expenditure of Government of India will be flat at the budgeted level, slightly lower. That's what we projected. Even this requires a 34% expansion in the pace of expenditure in the last 5 months of this fiscal year. So it's a lot, but we do think that the improved revenue visibility will allow for the spending to happen. And if it does happen, that's something that can give a boost to the overall economic impulses in the second half of the year. We are currently pegging the fiscal deficit of Government of India at 14.5 trillion for this fiscal year, which works out to 7.7% of GDP. So this is what we think is the realistic fiscal deficit given where we see the revenue position and how much expenditure we think is actually feasible in this fiscal year, given what has happened so far. For the state governments, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Overall, in terms of the borrowing envelope, the financing envelope, our calculation shows that most of them should be able to incur a fiscal deficit, borrow, and therefore incur a fiscal deficit of around 4.8% of GDP. So our calculation for the general government fiscal deficit is closer to 12.5% of GDP for the current year. For the state governments, what we've noticed is that the state development loan issuance has actually contracted in the first 3 auctions of December that we've seen, after a 48% expansion up to November. So looks like healthier tax inflows during the festive season have allowed the state governments to actually pull back a little bit on the borrowing, and also the funding that has started coming in from Government of India in terms of the GST compensation that Government of India is borrowing and on lending. That also seems to have helped the state governments to borrow less on a YOY basis on their own accord in the 3 auctions that we've seen so far in December. And we have anecdotal evidence that is suggesting that the recent trends in expenditure are mixed across the states. So our view is twofold. One, that this unevenness in central government spending will continue even in Q4. And secondly, that there is going to be a large adjustment in central tax devolution in Q4. And that is probably something that may again derail the spending process for some states where liquidity may end up being a concern. Lastly, on the investment side, business sentiment has certainly recovered, but we don't think that private sector investment activity is going to pick up in a very broad-based manner until the second half of next year, until there is a lot more visibility of an actual rollout of the vaccine and the outlook in terms of global and domestic GDP growth. So net, our view is that next quarter, with the base effect and with some real recovery in the economy, we're going to get a 1.3% expansion in the Indian GDP in real terms. And therefore, the total contraction in GDP is going to be limited to 7.8%. So I think our H2 forecasts are slightly less optimistic than NCAER's, but ballpark is similar. That's the end of my slides. I think I have covered most of what I wanted to. On the yield side, I'll just add a couple of comments that with the kind of fiscal stress that we're seeing, with the kind of expansion in the fiscal deficit we're talking about, inflation at the levels that it is, crude oil prices having risen to the levels that they are, and very little interest of the FPIs in actually investing in Indian debt. The fact that yields are still contained below 6% for the 10-year GSEC, I think is talking a lot about liquidity and the measures that the RBI has taken to actually keep a cap on the 10-year yield. So that's the only other comment that I wanted to make. But thanks to all of you for giving me this opportunity to speak and share ICRA's views today. And thanks to all of you for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Aditi. I think this was truly a 2-for-1, where we got almost as comprehensive a view from you. And it's always great to see the gaps that we have analysts when they look at the same data or slightly different data. So it's very useful to have this counterpoint. And I'm sure it'll be very interesting to see where we end up with. Let me turn now to our second guest for the evening, Shekhar, Chief Economist at the National Stock Exchange. Shekhar, over to you.
I will not bother everyone with a third presentation, going over the same indicators, particularly given the large amount of intersection that we would inevitably have with our presentation, with both the presentations, particularly with Aditi. So I will save myself with some of the comments on the presentations, on the first presentation especially. My compliments on such a deep and in-depth analysis of all major segments of the economy, and truly it's indeed illuminating to see so much analysis, in-depth research, and conclusions coming out in what has been an extremely difficult year. I will save my comments on some parts of the presentation. Our sense currently is that we are not out of the woods. We are clearly not out of the woods. Back in March, we had 2 issues for the economy to fight: how to get over the coronavirus pandemic, and second, what to do with the inevitable consequence of the lockdown that we had, and the recession that we had for 2 quarters. Now that we seem to have passed to some extent the first of the worries. The pandemic numbers are largely under control. Dr. Mundle's presentation showed it fairly clearly. The in many of if you look at the spread, it is largely contained towards the urban centers. And I agree entirely that if one is able to contain the pandemic in these urban centers, and I live in Mumbai, and what we consider the benchmark would be if trains are allowed to be open for the public in Mumbai. That would be the signal where the pandemic is truly under control. So why I'm spending some time on the pandemic is there is beyond the indicators that we saw in these two presentations, there's an inevitable amount of uncertainty that's there in the economy towards both materialism and experiences. To quote from Aditi, until we get rid of this uncertainty, we will have below potential sort of growth and in the recovery, and our recovery will be extended. I also wanted to spend some time on the presentation where Dr. Mundle spoke about hysteresis. We fully agree, and there have been several commentaries that have come in towards how we have lost growth that may not be may not come back in a hurry, despite what you generally see in terms of percentage YOY growth. The actual production of the actual value add, those numbers are likely to take several years to come back. And this brings us to a point where we must understand that the economy since FY16 has been on a downward growth slide that actually got severely exacerbated thanks to the COVID crisis. Now, to expect us to come back to a pre-crisis stage is something is possible. But when do we get back to a growth that we saw in FY16? Rather, that would be a question probably we have to see for the medium term. And in fact, in the presentation, what we just saw that the base path was looking at about sub 6% GDP growth. This is a far cry from what we have been expecting for India, at least a growth of at least 7+% or 8% in the near to medium term. On the inflation front, our forecasts are marginally lower than Dr. Bhattacharya's. We believe that the sharp correction in vegetable prices that we've seen in winter might have a slightly depressing impact on overall CPI inflation levels. And while I agree on the CPI core inflation being above 6%, we believe that there is some room for inflation to come down to sub 6% levels, particularly towards the end of the first quarter of the next fiscal. But having said that, we believe that the quandary for the current monetary policy committee continues to remain. We see inflation on one side at 6% plus, 4 plus or minus 2% was the agreed band. We've seen inflation above that level for several quarters now. While we do get a sense of from the MPC minutes that or from the policies that we will have an accommodative monetary policy for the foreseeable term, one has to see what happened to the mandate of the MPC. Now, this is something as the MPC comes up for discussion again in early next year. One has to see what kind of objectives is the central bank really following. Are we going back to a multiple indicator sort of approach, which was there before 2016, or would we continue to have a situation where on one side we profess to a single election, single inflation target mandate 4 plus or minus 2%, but keep not raising rates. So this is something that continues to bother us. Another worry on this perspective is if flows continues to continue. Today was a different day. Markets fell meaningfully, but flows from FIIs have breached $21 billion. That's the highest in 10 years. And flows in November, we may not likely see such a month come about again. But flows have been severe, and issues on what to do with the currency, how to maintain the currency, really do concern us. A quick appreciation in the currency, as Dr. Mundle pointed out, will have its own detrimental impact. You will see any nascent recovery in trade going under thanks to the appreciation in the currency. And what it has made is, even from a real effective exchange rate perspective, our currency is severely appreciated at the moment. And what happens if you see one more month of high flows, particularly with the Fed commentary, with the central bank commentary in general being extremely liberal? What happens to one more flow, one more month of a November 2020 kind of flows where you have $5-6 billion coming in a month? Is something that one has to see. What will it do with the current inflation outlook? Will the central bank allow inflation to go up further thanks to the inevitable increase in M3 that's happening, or will it allow the rupee to appreciate from current levels? So I think there are several questions. We do see an immense amount of fiscal dominance in the economy. This was also highlighted by Dr. Mundle very clearly. The amount of borrowing that's happening is severe. The amount of crowding out that's happening is also severe. We've now seen about 7 years of wait for a revival in private corporate capex. We've also seen about 5 years, barring the small period in 2018 when the RBI actually raised rates for 2 quarters. We've actually seen rates come down from a policy rate perspective from early 2015, and over that period, we have seen growth come down from around 8% now to about slightly higher than 4.2% at the end of FY20, and this year we are looking at a recession. So we have several difficult questions ahead of us in the economy, and I would just say, while now we are in somewhat control of the pandemic, I would just quote Churchill. When the Battle of Britain was over, he said, "This is not the end. This is not even the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning." So we've got in the first question. Let's see what we can do with the economy. I'll stop here, Shekhar.
Thank you, Shekhar, for your very thoughtful comments. I think there's one thing we can be sure of is that the situation now and going into the next few quarters will demand the most serious macro expertise that India has ever needed. And I believe choices that are made incorrectly, whether in quantum, in timing, in direction, targeting, will create difficult issues for our country. It's not just the hysteresis issue, but alongside hysteresis is society and our demographic dividend. And all of that we are expecting will give us the big boost to get us into a serious middle income territory is going to be affected by the choices that we make. And in that sense, discussions like this and the involvement of Aditi, you, and of course our own NCAER macro team is really important to raise consciousness within government, within society, in the media, about what a critical juncture we are at. And really, I cannot emphasize how well we might be able to do or how badly we will do, and as we muddle through or really rise to the occasion. So I think that to me comes across as being terribly, terribly important. There are concerns about macro expertise all over the country, and we need that very badly. I'm very glad that Shashank is here, Shashank Bide, our research director and senior advisor, who of course is a member of the MPC. I'm sure he's taking careful notes for discussion at the MPC. We have a whole bunch of questions that have come up, but we are also running out of time since it's almost 8 o'clock. Sudipto, how do you want to handle it? Would you like to pick a few? And Ratin, I know, has been very active. Others have also been talking. Lele Song from the ADB has a question. If I might just read that out for you, Sudipto. He says the tough call for fiscal policy. You've seen that question. Would you like to answer Lele Song's question about
well, I can see only that, Shekhar. I'm in our arrangement. I'm not actually seeing all the questions, so I'll leave it to you to choose what you want us to answer. But this one I can see from Lily Song, and I can answer
Can you
it.
please respond to that, and then I'll pick up a few more.
Yeah. Lily, as you would have noticed, what I said is that we are very concerned, of course, with this huge rise in the sovereign debt GDP ratio and its implications for crowding out and so on, which Dr. Patnaik also talked about. On the other hand, we have to recover, and we have seen the long-term costs of the big negative shock we've received. So it is a tough call. Our take, which I was trying to explain, is that if you substantially expand your public expenditure so that you try and give a boost to growth, but expand it less in nominal terms compared to the growth of the economy. So I give an example, if the economy is growing at 15% and you expand your expenditure by about 12%, assuming an inflation of 5%, that still gives you a 7% growth of expenditure in real terms, and that's a substantial thing. However, it does mean that your deficit will be coming down, because if the revenue keeps rising, like a buoyancy average is around 1, so buoyancy means that revenue would rise at the same rate as nominal GDP, then your deficit will be coming down. So it's a kind of balancing act between gradually bringing down the deficit while you keep pushing on the expenditure on the growth side. This does mean contraction in the sense of the fiscal, what we call the fiscal impulse coming down. But we have to remember, this is not the only growth driver, the fiscal. There's the monetary part. Then hopefully, if really the pandemic thing we are able to bring it under control, we can't eliminate it, the COVID-19, that will give a strong boost. There is some uptake in investment and in the exports so far we've seen. Hopefully that will continue. None of us can guarantee that. But most importantly, and I want to emphasize this, game-changing reforms to give a positive kick to the economy to, if you will, neutralize the effect of the negative shock that we just had this year. That is very important. Let me stop there.
Okay, thanks, Sudipto. Let me see. Oops. I'm on the wrong screen, sorry. Yeah, no, I'm on. Rudrani, would you like to comment on any of the Q&A or the questions or the chat that have come in? Ratin has been very active, also asking, this is a bit of a technical point, so maybe we can take it offline, about the use of autovar models where there's a huge structural break. And Manoj Panda also had a question on the same issue. So any of those questions, would you like to handle? Then I think we probably should be closing because it's past 8 already. Rudran. Are you muted, Rudran?
You're muted.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So now, to answer this question, yes. So the question of structural breaks are already taken care of in our model. So it's the model is particularly we process information from a large number of high frequency data, and then we through factor analysis, and then we connect this factor with the GDP growth rate in a time varying coefficient model. So in a state space format, we allow the parameters of the model to vary over time automatically. It's not that we impose certain dates or put some dummy. We just make the parameter to vary over time, and through that process, it automatically takes care of the structural changes over this that's happening in the economy. And what's the other question? I actually can't find the question.
Well, there were questions both in the chat as well as in the Q&A box. So it was a little mixed
Yeah,
bag.
Q&A box, I have answered by typing.
Several of them.
Several of them.
Yes, you have. I guess a big question also is finding the right balance for the new budget, which Ministry of Finance is very busy working on at the moment. It's almost time. I assume they'll keep working through January and then pretty much close shop by the third week of January, when they must print up the budget speech and the budget documents. But a big question will be the extent of fiscal measures, as well as I think in the Q&A, there's a question from, is it Subumoy? I'm not sure. Charji, I'm just trying to see it. 1 second. Yeah. Question from Subumoy Bhattacharjee about what should GOI do to make space for the capital sector spending in fiscal 22. What would be our fiscal deficit take? And here I would also turn to Aditi and Tirthankar. What is their sense of how much can the government do and what that does to crowding out? What does that do to fiscal dominance we've talked about, and what that might do to inflation? And where is the RBI and where is North Block on this? Ludwani, do you want to take that, or should I just turn to Aditi and Tirthankar?
Yeah.
I was going to, sorry.
Sudipto, go ahead, please. Go ahead.
No, because I directly addressed this, Shumo, it's a very good question you're asking. It depends very much on what assumptions the central government is going to make about GDP growth and inflation next year. I gave an example which I think is probably in a realistic ballpark of a 15% nominal GDP growth, of which 10% would be real, 5% would be inflation. If with those numbers, I would suggest increasing the expenditure growth by a little lower than that, so say about 12%. As you know, I mean, the deficit, we all talk about what is the deficit, but really the only variable the government actually controls, its policy handles really expenditure. It's not the deficit, because it can set what it likes, but the deficit depends on, it's a residual which comes out depending on how revenue performs, and that the government cannot say. What it does set directly is expenditure, and I think if it sets that at about, assuming nominal growth of 15% at about 12%. So something like 3-4% below the nominal growth rate should be the rate of growth of expenditure, and then the deficit would come out of the wash from that.
What's the thinking on Dalal Street about this?
I think we shifted away from, if you look at from goals perspective, for several years we tried to go towards the 3% fiscal deficit target. Year after year we shifted that target, and as of the last 2 years we have gone towards the overall debt GDP ratio. Either way you look at it, fiscal numbers are in shambles at the moment, and they will take several years to be brought back. I think if there is a solution that Dr. Mundle has pointed out, that your overall expenditure does remain slightly lower than your nominal GDP growth, you are actually giving a semblance of fiscal prudence to the street. Everybody understands that at this point, fiscal numbers are off the charts. We are looking at double-digit fiscal deficit numbers. People also understand that you no longer should be looking only at center's numbers. You look at center, state plus CPSE borrowing. The overall impact has to be seen, in that totality. So any signal by the government of keeping or trying to keep this runaway spending under control or these ratios under control would send a very strong signal to the market.
Thank you, Tirthankar. Aditi, and before you turn to also this fiscal, Sudipto pointed out that one of the key issues on which the government must move is the financial sector. And the issue here, going back to discussions over many years of reducing the government's ownership share of the public sector banks. And of course, that would be very much in a direction that many people have been advocating. But it would also, indeed, if added to the disinvestment program, which hopefully can be accelerated, even if it is strategic disinvestment, can open up headroom for the government. On this, Aditi?
So let me start with a slightly different perspective on the disinvestment itself. See, our view is that this year there's going to be a large slippage as compared to the disinvestment target, but a lot of the plans which are underway may well fructify by next year. So there is an upside in any case from what may not happen in the current year that may help to give a boost to the government in the next year. And the kind of policies and plans that Shekhar, you and Dr. Mundle are talking about, certainly if that is something that is put in place as part of next year's budget, then we can expect that maybe by the end of next fiscal year or the following fiscal year that we will actually be able to see some fiscal outcome out of that, which will help to boost the overall revenue numbers. Now, I appreciate what Dr. Mundle is saying, but let me just put the numbers in a slightly different perspective in terms of the bottom line that the market would like to see. The market, unfortunately, is going to, of course, the revenue numbers and the assumptions are important, and expenditure is what is going to drive the economy. But at the end of the day, the market is going to be interested in what the fiscal deficit is that the government is targeting, because that is what is going to drive the borrowing program. So from that point of view, 3% fiscal deficit target has been an impossible ask in the Indian context. Let's put it aside. That's definitely not something that we can aspire to within 1 year of a pandemic, as debilitating as what we've been through in 2020. So my sense is that the market would find a fiscal deficit of around 5% of GDP being targeted in the budget to be something that is reasonable. And as long as the revenue assumptions behind the math are reasonably credible in a continuing uncertain outlook, then I think a 5% fiscal deficit to GDP is something that the market would find acceptable. Now, beyond that, of course, we have to see what are the tax, non-tax, and the disinvestment assumptions, and what is the kind of expenditure that will be permitted. Within the space which is available for expenditure, I think the foregone conclusion now is that health has to be prioritized, vaccine availability has to be prioritized, and capex must absolutely be brought back in terms of the projects that are ready and where the pipeline and the awards are immediately scalable. Then that is what the government should be able to focus on. So for Government of India, we are looking at 5%, perhaps as the midpoint of a range that Government of India may wish to target, especially given the kind of continuing uncertainty that we expect the budget to be presented in just a few weeks from now. It's not that far away in terms of the budget presentation. For the state governments, perhaps 3.5% of GDP is something that the Government of India could consider allowing because the revenue uncertainty will continue for the states also. So general government deficit without adding in the public sector undertakings, we are looking at about 8.5% of GDP is perhaps what is going to be targeted for next year. And obviously, how soon the revenue visibility comes back, how quickly does the economic activity recover and therefore revenues recover because of that, will drive the expenditure space which is actually available, which will push the economic activity as well. So bit of a chicken and egg situation, but this is what we think could be reasonable and credible in terms of the borrowing, of course, which needs to be funded by the market.
Thank you. Any final words from NCER, from Sudipto, Konali? Otherwise, if Mr. Shrivastava is still here, I'll hand over to him, or we'll end the discussion, which has been very comprehensive. We've gone over 2 hours. I suspect we will keep going because there's so much to be discussed here. And I hope that people in the portals of power are also listening in. I think this is all going to be very valuable. Sudipto, do you want to final word?
No, I think it's been a very, very good discussion. I particularly want to thank Dr. Patnaik and Aditi. And also the questions, I haven't seen most of them actually, but I hope I'll get a chance to see them. So yeah, thank you, and thanks to everybody who attended and patiently listened to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and let me thank the entire group of panelists, but also our attendees. They numbered well over 100 at its peak. Clearly, this is a topic and subject of intense interest both for those who think about public policy, but because it's going to affect every one of us in terms of our own ability to navigate this immense problem that our country is facing and other countries are facing as well. So with that, let me bid everybody a very good evening. Thank you all for joining. Thanks in particular to the NCR team. And most of all, thank you to the India International Center for co-hosting this and for making it possible for us to again mount this video review of the economy. And we celebrate the name of Malcolm X in that process as well. A good evening to all, and please stay safe. And we look forward to see you again on one of NCR's very frequent webinars. Bye-bye and good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.